The theme for our Fringe is the Employment Rights Bill. As you'll know, it's been a tortuous route so far for the bill getting where it is now. It started with the New Deal for working people. It turned into a green paper seen through by Andy MacDonald. It then turned into Make Work Pay from the Labour Party, and that is now the Employment Rights Bill currently going through its parliamentary process. It's very difficult, I'm sure you'll agree, to keep up with the content and the changes to the Employment Rights Bill. It's about 300 pages long, or at least it was last time I looked. There's hundreds of government amendments that have been tabled. There were more amendments tabled in the Lords. I'd call those wrecking amendments because they did the best that they could to weaken the bill still further. The Act is due at the end of this month. Well, more importantly, between then and 2027, it's due to be implemented, so still a bit of a delay. There's more confusion, of course, this week with the resignation of Angela Rayner and the removal of Madders. Two people who have worked on the bill throughout its parliamentary passage. We don't know who is going to be in charge of dealing with the bill now, which is all the more important given that we are going into a period of consultations and developing regulations. What we do know is that more needs to be done. If the New Deal for Workers is to be implemented in full, at CTUF and the Institute of Employment Rights, we've been calling for a second bill. You should find on your chair a postcard campaign. If you want to fill in that campaign and hand it over to Henry, who will, at the right time, be sitting in the corner there, you can hand it in to him. It's just to keep momentum around what is needed in the Employment Rights Bill, how it doesn't meet expectations yet, and how more needs to be done. Details of what more needs to be done is in a 6-page briefing paper that will be on the TUC Institute of Employment Rights store tomorrow. It also forms the wraparound in today's Morning Star, so do pick up that if you get an opportunity. But tonight we will hear the thoughts of our speakers, and we have an excellent panel to turn to. I'm going to speedily go on to them because given the late start of the Fringe and the fact that the GFTU are holding their social immediately afterwards at 8:30, we need to gallop along. So I'm going to start by introducing our speakers, and our first speaker tonight is Eddie Dempsey, who, as I'm sure you all know, is the General Secretary of the RMT. So Eddie, welcome.
It's working. You can hear me anyway, can't you? So look, we're in a strange position after the announcements that have happened following the resignation of Angela Rayner. But in its initial stages, we welcomed the Employment Rights Bill as an extremely important step forward in workers' rights, along with the Institute of Employment Rights. I think you did the same thing. And then through its progress in Parliament and in the Lords, we've seen various amendments, as has been alluded to, watering down key aspects of it, and we've always argued it doesn't go far enough. So the idea for a second Employment Rights Bill is one that we automatically support. But I'm less clear whether we're going to get the original Employment Rights Bill at all, following the recent announcements. I'm not going to go into all of the detail in the bill in the various areas, but there's a couple of really key parts of the bill for us and tests in the RMT. I heard some of the debate in TUC today, and there was mention of this being a protection against another P&O. I don't believe it is at all. Extending the consultation rights for people in a situation like that makes absolutely no difference at all when the employer is intending to act completely illegally and breach all of the consultation regulations in the first place. One of the key things that we were calling for is the inclusion of a real-time mechanism for us to bring an injunction against an employer should they act in breach of employment law. If we had that available to us back when P&O happened, we might have been in a better place. And the second thing that we wanted, and it's probably the most important thing that we wanted in an employment bill at all, was sectoral collective bargaining. Now we've got it in one sector, there's the opportunity to build on that, potentially to broaden it out. But I just want to impress upon people the importance of having sectoral collective bargaining and why it was the #1 and most important thing to us in the RMT union. We're less focused on individual rights. We're less focused on whether or not you get sick pay from day one or not. Of course, we support the principle that you should. But our belief is if you've got sectoral bargaining, in fact, the only thing we want the government to outsource at all is these matters to us in the trade union movement. Don't worry your head about individual rights and bad management and cowboy employers. Give us sectoral bargaining and we will discipline the employers in the sectors where we organise. It also acts as a mechanism to prevent bad activity from rogue employers like P&O, because in the case of P&O, if we had sectoral bargaining and they did what they did, we would have put a call out to bring workers out right across the sector. So you would have had other employers saying to rogue employers, don't take that step because you're going to damage the profitability of all of us in that sector. And it's even more important than that, because when you look at where we are now as a trade union movement, much diminished, halved in terms of trade union membership, trade union coverage on contracts of employment in Britain have absolutely plummeted. And if you look at the social division that we're facing right across the country, particularly in areas that have been totally deindustrialised, one of the things that was lost, the most important thing in some ways that was lost from a social point of view, wasn't the industry, wasn't the jobs, it was the trade union movement. People have been robbed of their movement and their culture. We were the stitch that held societies together right across Britain, because we weren't just a membership card, it weren't just about the wages, it was the charitable arrangements, it was the social clubs, it was all of the activity we did and all of the foundation of our movement that brought people together no matter where they were from and no matter what they looked like. That has been ripped away from communities right across Britain. And the only way I can see of bringing some of that social cohesion back is by delivering sectoral collective bargaining and putting trade unions back where they belong. We are the people who are specialists in bringing people together. I've stood on picket lines with people I disagree with fundamentally, but once you've got people into that place where they're prepared to support each other in the workplace, before long those antagonisms and differences start to melt away and people start to recognise each other as workers, as part of a class. And there's nothing that brings those realities to bear quicker than getting people into a trade dispute. And I've seen it happen in real time. I've stood on picket lines with people who you wouldn't be able to persuade away from strange opinions on politics and on immigration and everything else. Once you get people out on a picket line together, recognising their solidarity is the only thing that keeps them together, that's the most important step. And that is why I think this government has missed the most important part of that bill. Because a government that says it's worried about a reform insurgency, the #1 thing you could do to push that back would be to bring in sectoral collective bargaining and let us, not parliamentarians who speak like aliens and don't know how to string a sentence together, have no appeal to ordinary people. Don't worry about them, let us do it. Let our members do it. We know how to communicate with people in our communities, we know how to put the case across and deal with division. That is a surefire way of dealing with that, and that has been lost, and that's something we think is absolutely critical. With the status of worker, I don't know where we're going to end up with that, but the simple fact is, this does not outlaw 0 hours contracts. So right now in our industry, we estimate nearly 50,000 people working on 0 hours type contracts in infrastructure. We've got people right now, hundreds and hundreds of them, in fact, working on the infrastructure in London Underground, where we're on dispute, on 0 hours contracts. We estimate 9 out of 10 people in the supply chain of the railway who are part of the labour supply chain now are on 0 hours contracts of one type or another. That could be sorted out tomorrow if we beef this bill up. And that would also strengthen us, it would strengthen this government. But they're not doing it. And these recent spate of sackings gives me real concern. And I don't understand the politics of it, because you can clearly see that the Labour Party is very nervous about reform and is trying a number of things to appeal to reform voters. I'm an admirer of flags. I'm an appreciator of flagpoles. We've heard all of that. But the real fact of the matter is, people that are turning to reform are people who are in our movement and on the fringes of our movement and live in our communities, not theirs. People that are voting reform are working class people who also want decent rights at work. That would be the biggest weapon they could use against reform, but instead it seems they're peeling away from it. So we're disappointed as it stands. We've seen the hostile amendments in the Lords around thresholds. I've got to tell you, and this isn't a recommendation that anyone might be listening, I don't care about thresholds, because we beat thresholds. What I want is the ability to take our members from being in dispute into industrial action and out on the cobbles as fast as possible, because that is where we get our industrial power. The quicker you can move from an episode of dispute into actual live industrial action is all of the better. And so the time limits that have been reduced by a couple of days are not enough. We're disappointed with that legislation too. So we will have to see where this comes to over the next period, but it's not looking good. It seems that there is a wholesale shift. Anyone who's got anything to do with this bill is now sacked, which is not a good start. This TUC Congress was supposed to be about, I think from some people, promoting the Employment Rights Bill as the biggest step forward for workers in a generation. Isn't it great we've got the Labour government and all the rest of it? And I'm going to finish up on this. We have got a government whose legislative programme is for the biggest wave of insourcing in a generation, for improving individual and the collective rights of workers and driving up living standards. But right now my members are stopping the capital city of this country, and will be doing so for a week. In London Underground, in Dockland Light Railway, outsourced members associated with that supply chain. We've just got into dispute with our outsourced members on London Underground. And on top of that, in the contract documents related to Crossrail, we find buried in that document a schedule for the closure of all ticket offices on the Crossrail network, which they quickly redacted and put back into the public rail. They're not quick enough for our lot, because we spotted it straight away. So we've written to the Mayor to understand, well, what is your position on this? Because we've just had the biggest public consultation, actually, of any public consultation in recent times, during the national disputes on the railway. We know what the public's disposition is towards the closure of ticket offices. Why we are repeating the mistakes of the previous Tory administration in London is absolutely beyond me. We were literally about to put a pay offer out to all of our members on the Crossrail network, which included an agreement by us in good faith to discuss arrangements around ticket offices. That's gone. We've pulled it because we're dealing with somebody who's not dealing with us in good faith. You want us to discuss arrangements around ticket offices, but we see in the background is actually a plan to shut the whole lot of them. So right now in London, we've got people that are continuing to outsource our members. Our cleaners in London Underground are out to tender. The Crossrail itself is going out to tender. Right now London Overground is out to tender. And if that was brought in, you could bring it in exactly as it is, and we'd have an extra 7 million plus in revenue coming through the door straight into the system that could be reinvested elsewhere. So while there's a legislative programme on a piece of paper that says the biggest rate of insourcing in a generation, the improvement of individual rights for workers, getting rid of 0 hours contracts, getting rid of fire and rehire, nationalisation, what we see in practice is the total polar opposite. So for us, we don't have a lot of confidence in this. If it was what it said it was going to do, we were absolutely right to welcome it as the biggest step forward for workers' rights in a generation. Right now, this is looking at it's in tatters. And so I'm disappointed, members of my union are going to be bitterly disappointed, and we will have to see what happens over the coming days.
As ever, yeah, and I'm glad you've identified the same priorities as we have: sector collective bargaining, the right to strike and picket, and status of workers. That's what we'll be pushing for. That's why we're calling for a second bill. So I'm glad to hear you're with us. We're with you this week, by the way. So good luck in your dispute. I don't think you need luck. I think you'll be there and your members will be supporting you. So thanks very much for that. Moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ruth. She is Vice President of the Institute of Employment Rights. Welcome, Ruth.
Thanks, Pat. So, as mentioned, we've got this wraparound of the Morning Star, finishing the job, Forward to Employment Rights Bill number 2. So why is it that we're arguing that a second employment rights bill is necessary? Well, there's a number of different ways that you can assess the employment rights bill. Does it do what the Labour Party said that it would do? Does it do what it would need to do to bring UK labour law into line with international labour standards? Thirdly, does it do what it would need to do to address the crisis facing trade unions in this country? Does it do what it would need to do to right the balance of power that has shifted so greatly towards employers since 1979? In recent years, we've seen the growth of the unregulated platform economy, the rise of insecure jobs through practices such as zero-hours contracts, and the power of employers unilaterally to vary terms and conditions of employment. Along with that, hand in hand with that, we've seen the growth of inequality and rising poverty as the share of wealth created by workers is taken in profit rather than distributed in wages. So what does this bill do? When you look at the bill, it has individual rights, it has collective rights. In terms of individual rights, the bill makes changes to existing rights and it creates some new rights. A huge amount is left to future legislation, it's left to future statutory instrument, with the bill only creating the necessary legislative powers for those statutory instruments. So a lot remains to be seen. What we can see is that the new rights that are created are not insignificant, but they're really quite modest. So for example, there is a new right to bereavement leave. But look at the detail. That's an unpaid right. Okay, there's nothing in the bill about anyone getting any wages when they take this bereavement leave. So it'll leave very many people unable to afford to take that leave. Same with day one rights to paternity and parental leave, a very welcome change. It means that people don't have to have been in employment for 6 months before they have rights to paternity and parental leave, but nothing about an increase in the right to having any pay. In some cases, the new rights fall short of what was advertised in the New Deal for Working People and the plan to make work pay, as Eddie already mentioned. So there's been so much talk about the banning of zero-hours contracts, but the bill does not ban zero-hours contracts. What it does is create a right for workers to be made an offer of fixed hours, a right which, as is emphasised in some of the accompanying documentation, workers remain free to refuse. Individual rights are not enough on their own to improve workers' terms and conditions. We know this from decades of experience now in this country, and we also know it when we make comparisons with other countries. Without a trade union presence in workplaces and without collective bargaining, employers remain free to interpret legal rules in line with their own priorities, to avoid the law by designating workers as self-employed in one way or another, and they even remain free to breach the law with impunity, as P&O showed. In the New Deal for Working People, Labour went some way towards recognising this, apparently. So this is a quotation from the New Deal for Working People. It said, "When workers are empowered to act as a collective, they are able to secure better pay and conditions. Strong collective bargaining rights and institutions at all levels are key to tackling the problems of insecurity, inequality, discrimination, enforcement, low pay, and other issues identified in this Green Paper." So there really seems to be recognition that you can give people new individual rights, you can strengthen the rights that they have, but if you want those rights to be meaningful, you also need to do something to strengthen trade unions and to widen the scope of collective bargaining in this country. The New Deal it included a number of proposals which aimed, it said, to strengthen workers' collective rights. And again, these were not nothing, they're not insignificant. But when you look at what the bill has actually done, what you see is, again, a lot of it is left to statutory instrument. And when you can see what's going to happen, you see that it falls short in some respects of what was promised in the New Deal. So just to mention two that are extremely important, the New Deal included an undertaking to roll out sectoral collective bargaining across the economy. The bill includes plans to have new bodies for pay determination in adult social care and school support staff respectively. But what is proposed in the bill is not suited for a plan rolling out across the economy, and indeed the bill doesn't make any mention of any planned rolling out across the economy. Most importantly, on industrial action, the bill, at least in its pre-House of Lords amendment form, the bill promised to largely repeal the Acts of 2023 and 2016. But that doesn't go nearly far enough, because even if you repeal those two bills in their entirety, what you leave in place is an outright prohibition of secondary action and a prohibition on taking industrial action in support of workers who've been dismissed for participation in unofficial strikes. So they remain in place despite the Employment Rights Bill in whatever form it is eventually passed. To conclude then, while the bill does extend the individual rights of workers, while it does include some new collective rights or some extension of existing collection rights, it does not respond adequately to the problems of enforcing rights and the problems of zero-hours contracts and other forms of precarious work. On any of the three measures I mentioned at the start of my talk, the bill falls short, and it's for that reason that we're arguing that a second bill is necessary.
Thanks very much for that, Ruth. Thanks for your excellent overview of what's in, what's not in, and what needs to be done to strengthen it. Just to remind you, finishing the job, the postcard campaign is on your chairs. Fill it in, hand it in to Henry in the corner, and we'll make sure that gets through to those empowered and those who are seeing through how this bill is concluded. So, moving swiftly on, our next speaker, I'm glad to say, is Fran Heathcote. Fran is the General Secretary of PCS, so welcome, Fran.
Thanks everybody for having me along tonight. I mean, I think really a lot of Eddie's concerns are concerns that are shared by PCS, and we have argued consistently for the points around sectoral collective bargaining, which as Eddie has explained why that would be so transformational. The one area the government could do that very easily is in its own backyard with our members, and whilst it was something that they talked a lot about in the run-up to being elected, it's something they've gone incredibly quiet on since. But today, to start with a positive, we do stand on the brink of the first substantial legislation to boost trade union rights in two generations. And we do recognise that. Without the policy work, the campaigning work and the negotiations that have gone on, we wouldn't be where we are today. It is the trade union movement and the Institute for Employment Rights working with Labour in opposition, first under Jeremy Corbyn and then later Keir Starmer, who fought so hard to get the bill that we have today. And the bill is not everything we wanted, as has just been explained by both Eddie and Ruth, or even hoped for. But it is a significant step forward if implemented. But the delays in implementation for some of those measures are really worrying us and something to be concerned about. Andy MacDonald, the MP, played a really key role in the early years under Starmer in protecting this policy from those seeking to drop it altogether. And trade unions have had to fight every single step of the way to get anything in this bill, to keep the measures within it, and we will have to fight again when the bill becomes law to ensure that every measure is implemented and enforced in full. But for all its flaws and all its delays, let's not lose sight of the gains it does contain. So the repeal of the last Tory government's anti-union laws are very welcome. They're welcome news for all trade unions and our members, and the repeal of the minimum service levels, which would have banned actually some members within PCS and many others from being able to take action at all. So if you think about our members that work on the border force under those minimum service levels bill, legislation, they would have been prevented from taking any action at all. And the removal of the ballot thresholds will come in quite soon after the bill becomes law. They were anti-democratic measures brought in by the last Tory government, designed to suppress workers, limit their ability to fight back through their unions against driving down pay and conditions and cuts to the services that they provide. And look who voted against repealing those measures, because it wasn't just the Tories, was it? It was Reform 2, who are a corporate-funded party working against the interests of working people. You don't need, nobody in this room needs me to explain that, but I think, you know, this idea that they're champions of the working class, nothing could be further from the truth. They voted against every aspect of this. Reform always seeks to divide workers against each other, and as trade unionists, we know that our enemy is not the migrant worker, but it's the underpaid boss, the overcharging landlord, the corporations that are ripping us off on our energy and water bills. It is trade unions that stand up for working class people day in and day out, and we do that by recognising one fundamental truth, and Eddie's gone, but I think this might be RMT's motto, and that is unity is strength. It's a fundamental truth for all trade unionists and for all socialists. When politicians try to divide us, whether that's by race, sexuality, or where they were born, they are dividing all of us. It is in the interests of us, to have us squabbling amongst ourselves, rather than uniting to get better pay, better housing and better public services for all. So as you might know, PCS represents members working for the government as security guards, as caterers and as cleaners, who until the summer have been striking over about 18 months to try and get better pay and rights for over a year. They are white, they are black, they are Asian, some were born in the UK, others are migrants, but they all suffered from low pay, insecure contracts, no company sick pay, no bereavement leave, and no decent parental leave. Most of them earn less than the minimum wage. Now let that sink in for a minute. That is a government contract. Those are government contracts that those workers work on, where they were receiving less than the minimum wage. And when we sought to settle those disputes, the biggest barrier to settling them was the fear that if you gave those workers a pay rise above the minimum wage, they would overtake core civil servants, because our members, in tens of thousands now, don't earn the minimum wage and have an enforced uplift every April just to keep the government within the law. So there is something really wrong with that. But that is what unions can achieve and do achieve day in, day out. We can never sit back and expect a government, even a Labour government, to do that job for us, and we have to fight for decent legislation, which is why the unions have political funds to campaign in our members' interest. And if you look at the Employment Rights Bill, it delivers access to statutory sick pay for the very first time for over 1 million more workers, and that is something that would have saved lives during the pandemic. And in fact, those workers I just talked about that have been on strike, many of them came into work throughout the pandemic with COVID because they couldn't afford to take time off, because on a government contract they didn't get paid sick pay. But too many of the provisions in the bill are being delayed. They've been delayed until 2027, including those day one rights and protections from unfair dismissal, the regulation of umbrella companies, bereavement leave, and ending exploitative zero-hour contracts. And they have been delayed to allow for consultation. And we know what that means, don't we? It allows big business more time to seek to water this down and get rid of some of it. So we're going to have to fight very, very hard to defend those gains, as the bosses and the corporate lobbyists will be working day and night and also fighting very, very hard to water down every aspect of those proposals. But we can't just fight defensive battles either. We have to go on the offensive. We owe that to our members who deserve to have dignity and rights at work, and they deserve to be taking home a larger share of the pie. 50 years ago, the wages of workers in the UK were worth nearly 2/3 of GDP. Today, it's around half. So I welcome the call for a second employment rights bill, because the employment rights and trade union rights that we have in the UK will still be inferior to those enjoyed by many other workers and unions in other European countries, and still fall short of the International Labour Organisation standards. So I quite like the idea of a new bill based on the UK adopting ILO standards in full, and with examples of where workers around the world have those rights. And then we can rightly go to the government and ask them, why can't workers in Britain have the same rights as workers in France? And why can't workers in Britain enjoy the same protections as workers in Ireland, for example, or in Germany? And that would be a really powerful way of demonstrating that we're actually only demanding equality with workers in other countries. And I think it would be an important lever that we could use. And it would also highlight the fact that so many British politicians, especially the Tories in reform, seem to want British workers to be the most exploitable in the Western world. So trade unions need to defend against the Employment Rights Bill. We need to campaign for that Employment Rights Bill Mark 2 that Cass talked about, and we will all work with our sister unions and the IER to secure the legislation that we have and to keep fighting for better. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks very much for that, Fran. An excellent contribution as ever. Excellent on the bill, excellent on politics, and excellent on the need for a united front across the Labour movement. Thanks. We're glad you're on our side, and we'll be on your side throughout your dispute. So thanks again. Right, moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Neil Todd. Neil is Head of Trade Union Law at Thompsons, and he's going to speak, I think, on fire and rehire and collective rights. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I just want to say a few words this evening about fire and rehire, and then a little bit afterwards on collective rights. So we all know the context of fire and rehire. This arose out of, it's nothing new, but it became ever increasingly common in the pandemic. And then obviously we had P&O in 2022, which resulted not in a conventional fire and rehire, but rather a fire and then a re-engagement of an entirely new agency workforce. So Labour came to power committed both to ban fire and rehire and ban fire and replace. So I just want to talk briefly about what we've got as matters stand now. So while the bill does include a clause that restricts an employer's ability to fire and rehire, those of you who may have followed the bill closely will realise that that right was amended in July, and there is now greater flexibility on an employer still to be able to use fire and rehire tactics, and it is vital that that clause is not watered down further. So what we now have in the bill in clause 28 is that an employee will be automatically dismissed if they refuse to agree to vary a prescribed term in a contract. Emphasis on the word a prescribed term. Likewise, an employee will be automatically unfairly dismissed if they are replaced by another employee or an agency worker or even an independent contractor, and one of the terms of that contract varies a prescribed term. So what are these prescribed terms? Well, the prescribed terms relate to 4 areas. They relate to pay, pensions, hours, and time off. And so it'll be automatically unfair if an employer varies any one of those 4 terms, subject to an exception I'll talk about slowly. However, when the bill was first announced, it was said that it would be unlawful to vary any term. There was no prescribed terms, it was any term in full. Now what we saw after that was continued lobbying from lawyers and other groups representing employers. And we heard that, for instance, we need flexibility to change employees' duties. And that's what we've now got, because employees' duties are no longer a prescribed term. And what employers said was, we want to introduce new technology, we need to have the right to do that. The government has ceded ground on that. They've not insisted that changes to duties should be collectively agreed or individually agreed, but they have now taken it out of the fire and rehire legislation. Now we know what's coming next, it'll be hours, because it's repeatedly said by employers that they need flexibility to change hours, they need to introduce new shift patterns, they need to, on occasion, to introduce weekend working. Now if we get hours taken out of the sort of prescribed terms, the right becomes even weaker, and we need to be firm when the consultation comes back this autumn that there must be no further watering down of that provision. As I said, there are two exceptions where you can still automatically, two exceptions where you can still dismiss in a fire and rehire situation, even when it amounts to a prescribed term. And they are the sort of financial distress circumstances. We've got one for private sector employers who are in significant financial difficulty and could not reasonably avoid the need to make the variation. There's a parallel test for public sector employers who are in such financial distress that they can't carry out their statutory functions. Now we think there needs to be further guidance around those exceptions, and particularly the sort of evidence that tribunals will need to see as to whether employers can really and honestly demonstrate that kind of financial distress. And the sort of guidance we need would be requirements around having to provide independent audited financial accounts to show that that distress is genuine. And just finally on fire and rehire, what's not included in a bill? And this is the point really that Eddie made at the outset today. Key part of UK employment law has always been that it punishes those who act in breach of the law, but it doesn't do enough to stop them. Now we do have strengthened rights in terms of increasing the cap on the protective award from 90 days to 180 days, but the government consulted on introducing a right to bring an injunction or bring interim relief to stop fire and rehire. That's what you need to do. That's, in P&O, it was a crass, calculated decision. Let's pay the compensation down the track because we know there's limited chance for employees and unions to stop it happening. Now there was a consultation to introduce that, and unfortunately the government has decided not to bring in injunctive relief in fire and rehire cases. That's a missed opportunity. They have said they will revisit that. When they do, it is really important that everyone pushes as hard as they can, because that sort of effective remedy is really what you need if you want to stop fire and rehire. Second, just to talk about industrial action. So the government came with a sort of a menu of what they wanted to do. We were told they wanted to repeal the Trade Union Act and the minimum services level regulations, as Fran has mentioned. We know that they wanted to introduce electronic balloting. They wanted to bring our balloting requirements so that into line with our ILO obligations that we have ratified. They wanted to simplify the recognition procedure, and they wanted to create a new right of access for tribunals. So assuming the bill gets royal assent this autumn, it will, at the outset, repeal most of the Trade Union Act 2016, and it will repeal the minimum services regulations. What is particularly disappointing, though, is that one of the key planks of the Trade Union Act 2016 was the 50% turnout requirement in industrial action. For reasons that I still don't understand, that is going to be delayed, and we're told that will not come into power until electronic balloting is introduced, which at the moment is forecasted to be in the autumn of 2026. So that, I think, is a real disappointment, when it would have been a statement from the beginning to repeal all of that 2016 Act. However, there is going to be some positive changes. We're going to get protection from detriment for those who take strike action. We're going to get stronger unfair dismissal rules in relation to taking industrial action, so it won't just be limited to the first 12 weeks of action. The mandate will increase from 6 months to 12 months. There will only be a requirement for the notice of action to be served 10 days before the action comes, rather than 7 days. There are also a simplification some simplification provisions of the notice requirements. There's also some improvements to the recognition processes. The 10% admissibility provision will be reduced, so a union will only need to show between 2% and 10% of membership when it goes for recognition. It will also not need to show at the outset that the majority of workers in the bargaining unit are likely to support recognition. We also have a situation where there will no longer, when you actually have a ballot for recognition, you will now only need to get a simple majority. There'll be no requirement to show 40% voted in favour of recognition. There'll be provisions to stop the flooding of bargaining units that we saw ASDA adopt against the JMB to deny GMB recognition. And we'll also have a right of access. But it still falls short in many areas that we hoped the employment bill would deal with. As an overarching point, there are still a series of hurdles to overcome any time a union wants to take industrial action. Any failure, even on one of those hurdles, will render the action unlawful. There's still a very narrow definition of a trade dispute. You can't have a political dispute. Secondary action remains unlawful. The requirement to provide a notice of ballot continues despite the fact it has been repeatedly criticised by the European Committee of Social Rights. Why do you need a notice of ballot when after a ballot result there is already an additional requirement to serve a notice of action? Likewise, although it's welcome that we move from 14 days to 10 days, remember pre-2016 the requirement for a notice of action was just 7 days before the action takes place. Finally, just to end on these 2 points as well, on the statutory recognition point, statutory recognition will still just be limited to cover terms of pay, hours and holiday, where we were told it would be wider. And on this right of access has the ability to be truly transformative, but again it's weak on remedy, where you have a situation where it is up to the union, if it's denied access, to have to go to the CAC. The CAC will then make a declaration. If the employer still does not abide by that declaration, does not adhere to the terms of an access agreement, the union has to go back to the CAC to get it enforced. But the only penalty at the end of the day is a fine that the employer pays to the government. So the union spends all its time trying to enforce that access agreement, but no compensation will ultimately be payable to it for all the time and expense it has to go into doing that. So yes, the Employer Rights Bill is really welcome. We look forward to it being enacted in the autumn. It's imperative it's not watered down further. You know, as I emphasised in the fire and rehire provisions, and we must do all we can in the ongoing consultation processes to make points to continue strengthening it. And just to sort of end and agree with the other panel speakers, the fight then still has to go on because this bill does fall short in many of the key aspects we were promised. Thank you.
Detailed insight into two important aspects of the bill and for highlighting what we need to watch out for during the consultation and the drafting of the regulations. A lot of those issues are in the you'll find in stickers that I think are available, so take your pick. I've gone for repeal all anti-trade union laws and promote sectoral collective bargaining, but you can take your pick on what issue is most important to you and wear them proudly. I'm moving swiftly on because I understand that the rest of this fringe is taken. The next thing is your free fish and chips in terms of the Chief Executive Social, so I'm moving on. But I will in no means rush our next speaker, who is Sarah Woolley. Sarah, as you will know, is the General Secretary of the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union. They have a motion to Congress on this issue, I believe. She's also President of the GFTU, who are co-sponsors of what's happening tonight. So welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Ted. And I thought if I sat down and spoke to you, you might be able to hear me a bit better than we stood up and not getting into the microphone. What I'd like to start off by thanking everybody from the Institute and the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom for all the work that they do behind the scenes to support the affiliated unions. And doesn't the Morning Star look brilliant this weekend with the wraparound? Get yourself a copy if you've not already got one. From the very start, the Bakers Union has supported the principle of a new deal for workers. We backed it because our members in food production, fast food and hospitality are among those who need it most. They're the workers on lowest pay, with the least security, who have been pushed hardest by casualisation and zero-hours contracts. For them, employment rights aren't a political slogan, they are the difference between dignity and exploitation, between being able to pay the rent and not being able to pay it. So when the Employment Rights Bill was first announced, it gave people hope. We saw it, we were hopeful, but to be honest, the version that's now on the table is far, far too weak. Promises have been watered down. Nick's telling me he can't hear me, and I'm used to that from BGCM, so I'll pull the mic closer. The promises have been watered down, timelines have slipped, and the bold commitments that trade unions fought for are at danger of being lost in the detail. Or after this week, danger of being lost in total, to be fair, if we're going to be right. But that's why we say that this bill cannot be the end of the process, it's got to be the first step. We've got to have a second piece of legislation, a finishing the job bill, if you like, that delivers on the reality of what workers were promised. And for our members, and you know, Caddy just stole my thunder, there are some great stickers, so please do get them. I've got end zero hours contracts and single worker status for all on mine. But for our members, that means a real ban on zero hours contracts, not just a rebranding exercise, because there's no such thing as a not exploitative zero hours contract. Sectoral bargaining, so wages and conditions are raised across industries, not left to a race to the bottom. Clear and fair worker status. We've got to end bogus self-employment, and we've got to ensure every worker is properly recognised with full rights and protections. Stronger protections for union organising so that workers can build power in their workplaces without fear of intimidation or dismissal, and rights from day one that are meaningful and enforceable, not riddled with loopholes. Finishing the job also means making sure that these rights are not words on paper but backed up with enforcement. Because we know, and every rep that you have in your workplace will tell, your branches and workplaces will tell you, that without enforcement, bad employers will just carry on exploiting workers and treating fines as though it's just cost of business. With everything that's gone on this week as well, there's just one last point I want to make, because I am conscious we don't ever keep people from free fish and chips. Winning the New Deal in full is not just going to depend on legislation, and this is something that was pointed out in Tolpuddle that I've kind of taken on board. We can't just have a go at the government. It depends on us as a movement, and we weaken ourselves when we split ourselves off and pick and choose bits of the package that we want and back bits that suit our members whilst ignoring the parts that might matter more to someone else. That undermines the process every bit as much as Labour watering it down. So if we really want to, if we really want to finish the job, we've got to act like one movement, haven't we? Because an injury to one is an injury to all, and our campaign for employment rights has to be based on that principle. So we've got to be clear, the first employment rights bill is welcome, but it's not enough. It's got to be the foundation for a stronger second stage, a bill that genuinely transforms the lives of working people, that matches the original promise of a New Deal, and that is defended and advanced by a united trade union movement. That's what it means for us at the Bakers Union, and that's what we should all be fighting for together. Thank you.
Excellent contribution as always. I'm going to move on to our last speaker this evening. He is Nicola Contouris. He is the Vice President of the Institute of Employment Rights. We have a briefing from Nicola on the Institute stall which you can pick up tomorrow, but tonight you can hear it in person, so Nicola.
Hi, good evening. I'm here because, like you, I care passionately about labor rights. You all care about labor rights, right? Yeah. I also care about climate change. You care? Yeah. We all care about that. So much so that lately I've been looking into heat pumps. You know, heat pumps. So I called an engineer and said, I'd like to have a heat pump. comes to my place and says, well, you can't. I said, why? The house is old, it's leaking. You know, you don't have any double glazing, no insulation, there's draft through the door, and you can't. Unless you insulate the house. You know, if your house leaks heat, you can't have a heat pump. You can have the old gas boiler just working full time, but a heat pump is too sophisticated a machine to introduce, to retrofit into an old house that leaks heat, or that leaks rights. Labour law in the UK leaks rights, and unfortunately, the Employment Rights Bill doesn't change that. There's plenty of great ideas in the bill, plenty of great ideas in making work pay, but the system is not proof, it's not tight enough. It leaks rights in many areas. You've heard it tonight. Lack of enforcement powers, flexibility clauses, qualifying periods that are now going to be called probation periods. And one of the areas in which it leaks very obviously is the definition of worker. It is still way too easy for unscrupulous employers to simply transform a working person into a self-employed contractor and give them no rights, none of the existing rights, none of the new rights. And this is a trade union matter. It's of great importance for the trade union movement. The Deliveroo case was a collective labor rights case. It was about trade union recognition. It doesn't get more collective than that. And it doesn't just happen in the gig economy. It happens in all of your sectors. It happens in transport. It happens in hospitality. It happens in care. It happens in construction. It happens everywhere. And it will continue to happen more so once the bill becomes an act, because the stakes will be higher for employers. They will want to escape the few new rights even more vigorously than they have done so far. The incentives will be greater. They will become more crafty. There was a solution to this problem. It was possible to sort of draft-proof the edifice. There were some ideas in making work pay. The idea was the single worker status. Okay? That didn't come into the bill because a consultation was promised. The consultation hasn't happened yet, but we heard from Baroness Maggie Jones that one will take place before the end of this year. Pay attention to that. This is very important for the edifice of labor and trade union rights that is before us. It's strategically important. What is the consultation going to ask? More or less, we know what the questions are going to be. How do we move away from the tripartite employment status, employees, LIMBY workers, the self-employed, into one coherent status, a single worker status, where all workers get workers' rights. Some rights for the generally self-employed, which I find a double-edged, somewhat problematic pledge. You know, if you're entitled to labor rights, well, surely it's because you're a worker. Okay, they should fall under the new single worker status. If you are generally self-employed, presumably, if you're not a worker, you don't need these rights. You are probably not a self-employed person. You're probably an employer. You have your own stuff. So the questions will be there about status definition, which rights, tax status. We know what the questions are going to be because we've already had 2 consultations of employment status in this country in the past 10 years. We had the Taylor review, the following year we had another consultation. There are some technical problems, but there are also some technical solutions, and we know everything about that, especially in the Institute, because John Handy has been supporting and presenting everywhere an employment status bill, a worker status bill, with a new worker definition that is accompanied by a new employer definition, that is accompanied by legal presumptions of status, and all the other bells and whistles that you need in order to have a real workable new single status. So we've got the right questions, we've got the right answers. What's missing here is the political will. That's where we're going. We're limping from one consultation to the next. So this is where the role of the movement